Call the Investment Committee to order. Lamont, would you take the roll for us?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
State Treasurer, Mr. Moore. State Controller, Ms. Paquin. Good morning. Ms. Higa. Ms. Yamamoto. Ms. Dillon. Ms. Hendricks. For State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ms. Zumot. And for the Director of Finance, Ms. Wong Hernandez. Mr. Keeley, you have a quorum. Oh, Mr. Rosensteel?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Keeley, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Lamont. Before we begin the meeting, I'd just like to make a comment about statements from the public for today. So if members of the public are here to speak to us on items which appear on our agenda, so if the item is on the agenda, your comments will be heard prior to the agenda item being called. If you're here to speak on an item which is not on our agenda, that will come under item 14, public comments, which will be after lunch, sometime in the afternoon. Okay? So items which are not listed on the agenda will be heard during public comments, item 14, in the afternoon. Hope that's clear. And then for my colleagues on the board, on the committee, I would just ask that if you could make a note that when you have questions or comments on a specific item, and specifically questions for staff or our consultants, and you're referencing something from the agenda, if you could reference the page so that we can also look at that. And then procedurally, I'm going to try this today, is if you've spoken on an item and others have not spoken yet on the item, I'm going to ask if there are others who have not spoken yet to give them an opportunity to speak. And if there's not, then we'll go back to second round or third round comments. Okay, we'll try to see if we can do that today. Hope that's helpful. All right, so with that, I'll entertain approval of the committee agenda and work plan for the day.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and properly second without objection. Item 2 is the approval of the minutes from July 20th. Open session. Any changes to the minutes? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion for approval.
Second.
It's moved and properly second. Okay. And one abstention, Lamont? Ms. Vargas? The next items, there's a series of consent items, 3A through 3D. Anybody want to pull some items? There are. Let me see. Frank?
Yes, I had a quick question on item 3B, the corporate governance policy. I gave some questions to staff ahead of time and asked them to look at them. On this one, INV page 58, the risk management section, there's a comment there that says that that last line of the first paragraph was moved to the program structure section, but the program structure section doesn't appear to mention limited partnership investments and separately managed accounts. I was wondering where in the policy those two structures are mentioned.
So Aisha Stagny, Portfolio Manager and Corporate Governance. So what we did in that section is we previously did not break out the different components of the corporate governance program. It had addressed co-investments, but that was the only piece. So by inserting the activist managers, which are generally set up as limited partnership structures, and the sustainable managers, which are generally separately managed accounts, and then there's a separate section now on, well, the co-investment section is predominantly the same. We thought it addressed that. I don't know that it's necessarily needed to put the exact vehicle, but okay.
I had another question on a different item.
Sure, what's that, Frank?
Item 3D, special mandates policy. I had a few grammatical suggestions that I presented to staff before the meeting. I was wondering if those are going to be made. Okay.
Yes, they were totally acceptable.
Great, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Paul?
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question on 3A. So one of the things we're being asked to do here is to change the benchmark. And I think I'm okay with this, but I would prefer that in the future that when we change benchmarks, that it not go on consent. Because I think changing benchmarks is a significant decision. And I think what I would really ask is, I think this committee needs more understanding of benchmarks because these issues come to us and they're exceedingly technical. You know, the benchmarks are a jumble of names and letters and stuff like that, and yet we use benchmarks for two separate purposes. One is to measure performance of the fund. The other is to use as a measure for purposes of compensation of our staff. And we often use different benchmarks for those. And so I would like to request that at some future meeting, and before we are asked to make any further benchmark changes, that we have a training for the board about benchmarks, so that we understand, you know, the basis on which we determine benchmarks for the two different purposes. And I think our consultants in particular can be helpful on that. So that's a suggestion, but I'm okay with this one, but in the future, I'd like benchmark changes to not be on consent. The other question that I have is on 3C, and the reason I here is we're making some updates, but it seems to me there's parts of this policy that have not been updated, and I'm not sure why we update. In particular, we have in here the our inflation assumption that is now 3 years old, even though we made an inflation assumption adjustment since then. Why is that not incorporated into this?
Great catch. That's an oversight on my part. We want, you know, there's been a cycle of every 3 years where you do the asset allocation, every 4 years you do the inflation or the actuary assumptions. We want to put those in sync and populate those in here. So that's a great catch. If you are comfortable with that, I think that's a good edit we make today and correct that.
Sure. So, do you know where that edit would go, Chris?
Yeah, let me flip to the page real quick. Thank you.
What is it?
88.
So it's INV 88.
The little asterisk there below total risk and return estimates.
All right. So that edit will be made here. All right. Anything else on that, Paul?
No, thank you.
From 3C? Nothing else? Okay.
Thanks.
I need to find it.
So it's INV.
It's INV 88.
And what are we moving? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Chris, would you explain for us, again, the suggested edit that Paul has made so that Dana can be clear?
Under those total risk and return estimates, those are the capital market assumptions you adopted in June of 2015. At that time, you assumed an inflation level for the asset side of the portfolio of 3%. Paul's noting that you've changed that in your actuary assumptions. And Neil pointed out that because the table below is built off that assumption, that's partly why we stay with that stale number, is the CAPM are built off that inflation assumption. But what we can do is make a note that the actuarial assumed inflation rate or projected is changed to this. Those CAPM numbers are going to change in 2019 when we come back to you. So, and they're stale. They need to, you know, they're 3.5 years old. So, but we'll update them then.
Thank you. That sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dana?
So I too have questions and some edits. So the program doesn't allow me to, it doesn't tell me what page it is or what item it is, so it will take me a second to find it. So I am on IMV 18, and it's 3A, which was on, I don't know what policy it is.
Global equity.
Global
intern?
equity.
3A.
Okay.
We said utilized instead of utilize. Was that the catch?
Nope. Oh! But that's good.
Which paragraph, Dana?
I'm at the other strategies. So this other strategies is under management. And I just want to make sure that I'm clear that we're talking about management of these other strategies, not them as strategies, which would then put them in a different section, correct?
June?
Thank you. June Kim, Director of Global Equity. Dana, your understanding is correct. This
Okay.
is when we look to manage other strategies internally or evaluate some new strategies.
Super, thank you. And then, this one is 3B on IMV 59, which is what policy?
Corporate governance.
Corporate governance. So we're deleting the co-investments for the chief investment officer and deputy chief investment officer. So what are we doing with the co-investments?
I'm sorry.
We're deleting the co-investments under the delegated authority, the daily limits. Because we can't, our system's not gonna allow us to have more than one approval limit. So what happens to the co-investments? Who has those limits? Because the other one's capital calls.
Well, the capital calls refer to all capital calls, whether it's for a co-investment
Okay.
or a
So that would
manager.
take care of that.
Yes,
Okay,
correct.
thank you. And then on page 80, which is 3C. And I don't know what policy it is.
The investment policy. Investment policy and management
Management,
plan.
okay.
3C,
We're under-
Dana?
Pardon?
3C?
Yeah, 3C, page 80. Because in our electronic copy, it's 149. So it's, yeah, so it's, yeah. So under the standard of care, we're changing the term members to participants. And I'm wondering how consistent, first of all, I should probably say, thank you very much for trying to make these all consistent in the same format. I think it's gonna make it a lot easier for all of us. And particularly people that are outside the system. And I think you guys have done a heroic job putting these all together. Because I think it's a small heroic feat that we actually read all this too. But we usually talk about members and now we're going to talk about participants, and is that consistent with the language across the system?
I don't know if it's consistent with the language across the system. This was the paragraph where I had a sentence in there that many people objected to last meeting, so the lawyers rewrote this, so I hate to kick it over to Brian and Harvey, but they were the ones that gave me those corrections. I think it's because it's referenced that way in law.
Okay.
Is that right, Harvey? Brian? I'm sorry, Brian, I looked and I just, yeah, Brian, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
All
So
right,
it's
so
because the
then-
law reads that way.
Okay.
But I think you're right. We all tend to use the word members because it
Yeah.
sounds more inclusive. Participant sounds so cold.
I'm pretty sure we could change it.
Well, I just want, whatever it is, it should be the common term that we talk about, the people that we,
We do
Sure.
use the word
Give-
participant down in the lower paragraph.
Okay.
Because we're pulling it out of the
What are
code.
you talking about, how we use it in the
We were
system itself?
trying not
Yeah.
to change the legal standard, the standard legal language as much as possible.
okay. So we just need to be aware of that as we move forward, I guess. And then, oh, now, these are the edits, I'm sorry. On 3C still, page 86, under the asset allocation number 2. B does not have to have the word review because it's in the explanation above. And then, and I have tried to do formatting of items like this. I can never get it right, but under number 6, it goes to 1. And then 7, 8, and that one probably should remain the 7, 8, and 9?
Great catch. I somehow missed that. I apologize.
It's probably the program,
Yep.
not the person trying to operate it.
Put in the.
That's my excuse. And then on IMV 87, we're changing the flexibility out. We're taking out, or we would do this more frequently if there was significant change in our liability or assets. Are you, I mean, you must be okay with removing that language, Chris, because you don't think it's necessary?
We're not removing, if there's a line through it. It's just trying to reference a comment. We're not deleting the word. Sorry.
Okay, so we're not getting rid of or more frequently
Yeah,
if
it's
there's
trying to
significant
reference the
change?
comment. We're not getting rid of or more frequently if there's significant
Thank you.
change.
I
We'd want
thought
to
that
keep
was a
that in.
strikeout, okay.
We're just moving to a 4-year cycle.
Okay. And then on page 139, yeah, IMV 139, in the chart, in the private equity policy, we refer to the urban and underserved urban and rural California as UUR, but in this chart, it's UR.
That's exactly what Frank caught. The
Thank you,
treasurer's office
yeah, 'cause I
caught that
totally
too,
missed that.
so
Thank
we
you,
got
Frank.
that corrected.
Then,
I really appreciate the diligence and I apologize that we've let these creep through.
no, you're good. I totally understand, there was so much to read. And then I had a question about the benchmark, but somehow I lost it. So I'll come back to that, I guess. Well, no, I better not, because we're gonna vote on it, huh? I can't remember what the question was on the benchmark, and I just deleted it, so I apologize.
Special mandates?
It might have been under special mandates. And I was gonna ask if Stephen and Neil were comfortable with changing the benchmark. I think that's what my question was. Oh, no, this is what it was. We're taking the home loan program and we're putting it under fixed income. Is there a possibility that putting the home loan into the fixed income will be detrimental to them reaching their benchmark if it's a closed program? There's no return from it, or?
No.
Okay, we're good?
It's small. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's small and going away.
All right, and then my final comment then would be on Paul's comments about the benchmarks. We're going to be taking a look in compensation about how when benchmarks are changed in the investment committee, how that moves to corporate governance, or not to corporate governance, but to compensation. So I think, Paul, your comments on having some education on benchmarks would tie into that really well, so I support that also. You're welcome.
Karen?
Mine are just really minor. They're mostly edits. I've met with staff, and so I've expressed some of my concerns or questions to them. But this one is simply INV 105. Should there be just an insert about what we're doing this month? I guess it just keeps track of all the edits and the corrections to the documents itself. And then also INV 132, same comment.
Yes.
Okay,
We will always reflect the meeting in which you approve it.
okay.
Is that all,
and
Karen?
What we did.
That's all. And I had the other ones, but they've already been
They've been
answered.
addressed by Dana, thank you. Okay, seeing no one else in the queue, let's see what we have here. We've got the consent, 3A through D. with the edits and suggested changes. Any objection? Okay, those are approved. Also want to reflect the request by Paul that future discussions on benchmarks not appear on consent. I would support that. And we can work to have that education. I also support an education on the impact of the importance of benchmarks and have a better understanding individually and collectively. It's an important topic, so find a place to make that happen. All right. So it brings us to it brings us to 4. But before we do that, I apologize. I wanted to formally acknowledge and welcome our new Deputy CIO, Mr. Scott Chen. Would you just stand up, Scott, for a second so everyone can see you? Welcome, Scott.
Yay, welcome.
Look forward to working with you. Great. Item 4 is the investment consultant RFP. This is our item. We've had, for the last couple of years, we've had dual consultants, Stephen McCourt from Makita and then Alan Emkin's team, Neil Ruse here today from PCA. We're beginning the process to go through an RFP process. Does anyone have any questions about that at this time? If not, we'll just give direction to staff to begin that process. Okay, seeing none, we can continue, go forward with the process. Thanks. Item 5, Investment Insight Speaker. We have our speaker, Will Sutcliffe from Bally Gifford. I think June Kim will introduce him to us.
June Kim, Director of Global Equity. Good morning. Today's investment insight speaker is Will Sutcliffe from Bailey Gifford, which is one of our existing active emerging markets managers for global equity. His presentation will focus primarily on China. However, he is a portfolio manager for a broader emerging market strategy, so please feel free to ask questions about emerging markets in general, in addition to any China-specific questions you may have. And he's in from Edinburgh, Scotland, where they're located, so I will turn it over to Will.
Hello, good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Yes, I'm here from Scotland, so hopefully my accent isn't completely impenetrable.
Before you begin, we have 45 minutes slotted for your presentation. And I'm sure we have some questions that we'd like to engage with you in.
Great. I've got about 25 minutes of prepared comments, and then hopefully there'll be some. I'll see what I can do. What a way to start. Okay, okay, well, without further ado. I mean, let me just start by saying it is a great pleasure to be here. The relationship we have with CalSTRS goes back to 2006, and it's one we're extremely proud to have. It really is emblematic of exactly the sort of long-term partnership that we aspire to. So it is an enormous privilege to be invited here this morning to share some of my views on China. That's 1 minute wasted, but if we can just turn to China. This is one of those topics that I think does tend to polarize investment opinion. On the one hand, it's already the world's second largest economy. It's quite plausible it will be the world's largest economy within the next 10 or 20 years. And the prospect of participating in the wealth creation that's likely to occur along the way is understandably a very alluring one for a lot of investors. On the other hand, I sense there's still a great deal of skepticism on China. You will have heard that China has too much debt. You will have heard that China has too much corruption. You will have heard that there's not enough reform and there's not enough innovation. And there are aspects of the Chinese system, frankly, that will feel pretty uncomfortable to many of us. So from the perspective of CalSTR's own ESG policy, particularly in those areas relating to political rights and civil liberties. So I'll try my best this morning over the next 20 minutes to highlight some of what I think are the key longer-term issues in this debate at what I see as quite an important turning point for the country in political and economic terms. So if we flick to the first.
June's got it.
Oh, great. So yeah. Oh, I can do it. There we go.
Will you just speak up a tad, please?
Sure. Sorry. Is that better?
That's much better.
Sorry. Okay, I'd start by observing that China has come an awfully long way. When I first began my investment career in the late 1990s, China was a distant sideshow from the perspective of most investors. It was a backwater. Yes, it may have been 20% of the world's population, but it only accounted for 3% of the world's GDP. So on an income per capita basis back then, China was really no better off than the likes of Honduras or the Congo. Hardly anyone outside China predicted what happened next. And what happened next was, of course, one of the most remarkable takeoffs in economic history. And over the next 20 years, 1997 to 2017, China's GDP grew 15-fold in dollar terms. And you can see from charts like this one that the rise in China's economic importance has been mirrored by a rise in China's importance to the foreign investment community. This shows you China's weighting in the MSCI Emerging Markets Index. You can see that we're at about a third right now from 0 20 years earlier. And on top of that, there's been a lot of excitement in recent months about the possibility that we could be on the cusp of another step change in China's weighting in this index. And the reason for that is that indices like this one have historically only reflected Chinese companies listed on overseas markets like the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. This index historically hasn't included Chinese companies that are listed on the domestic stock exchanges in Shanghai and Shenzhen. And these are big markets. They're roughly twice the market value of Chinese companies listed abroad. And the reason for the recent excitement is that MSCI has just announced that starting this year, they will now be including these companies on the Shanghai and Shenzhen exchanges. They're known as A shares in their broader emerging markets and global indices. Now, before we get too carried away, MSCI have also said that they're initially going to include these markets at a tiny fraction of their total value because they're still concerned about the accessibility of these markets to foreign investors. They still have governance concerns, and they're still concerned about China's openness to capital flows more broadly. However, for what it's worth, MSCI have suggested that if China A shares were included at a full weighting today, that would take China to a 45% weighting in this index. So, how should we think about this? If you look at these charts, you can see that China is already an order of magnitude bigger than most other countries in the emerging markets index. If you look at the green bars, you can see that the next biggest countries in emerging markets, South Korea and Taiwan, they're less than half of China's weighting. If China were to go up to 45% of the EM index, then it would simply be bringing the country more in line with the sort of economic dominance that it already has. And you can see that in the blue bars. China today accounts for 45% of emerging markets GDP. The next biggest country is India, that's less than 10%. And then if you look at the next slide, it's a similar picture in a global context. This is the world's second largest economy. As I said, it accounts for 15% of global GDP, and yet it only accounts for 3% of global equity indices. This feels pretty anomalous. So where should this be? What's the right number? How quickly is China going to get there? And what will that mean for allocations to China and the future of emerging market allocations and global equity allocations more broadly? Now, these are interesting questions, but I think before we try to answer them, we have to take a step back and look at a more fundamental set of questions. What sort of economy does China want to be? What sort of companies might it be capable of producing? And what will the role of foreign investors be in that process? These aren't easy questions to answer, but the good news is that President Xi has given us a roadmap. Now, on President Xi's very first day in power, in October 2012, he declared that China's mission was national rejuvenation. Because after all, China has been the dominant world power for most of the last 2,000 years. It's only in the last 150 years or so that this dominance has been so rudely interrupted by the rise of the West. And getting back there to this dominance in both economic and geopolitical terms, that really is the essence of Xi's national rejuvenation. And according to this narrative, the rebuilding process began in 1949 with Mao's victory, and it ended in 2012, by which time China had successfully re-emerged as a middle-income economy courtesy of massive state-sponsored investment in infrastructure and export manufacturing. So the next phase the one we're in now, is about moving further up the value chain with a model based on consumption and services and innovation. The bad news is that consumption and services and innovation are very, very different to the sort of model, the growth by brute force model that China's pursued for most of the last 40 years. But the good news is the process is well underway, and in many respects, I'd suggest that China actually already is starting to look quite a lot like a developed economy. You can see that on the next slide. I think one of the clearest manifestations of this is the extent to which China has embraced technology. If you take e-commerce, for example, Americans do 10% of their shopping online. It's taken 15 years to get there. China, we're already at 16%. It's taken less than half that time. Social media. Americans spend on average 1 hour a day across all social media platforms. In China, it's more like 4 or 5 hours a day. So when it comes to the consumer internet, I don't think it's controversial to say that China is the undisputed global leader. It's certainly the only country outside the US that has been capable of producing internet titans. And you see that in companies like Tencent, in social media and gaming, or Alibaba in e-commerce. These are $450 billion companies, still growing at 40–50% year on year. Now, China isn't yet the leader in newer technologies like artificial intelligence or machine learning, but it's getting there. It's catching up fast. But the really big surprise isn't how innovative and vibrant the Chinese economy has become. It's the fact that this has happened in what remains politically a very, very authoritarian country. And in fact, if anything, under President Xi, it's become more authoritarian. And that isn't supposed to happen. Economics 101 tells us that Leninist single-party states are supposed to be good at the perspiration bit, but they're not supposed to be good at the inspiration bit. So this is a bit of a paradox. How should we think about this? Well, on one level, there's clearly been massive state support for technological upgrading, but in a lot of ways, this is just China playing to its strengths. And one of China's strengths, of course, is scale. This is a country with 1 billion internet users, all speaking the same language, all using the internet in a far more intensive way than most of their Western peers. And the sheer amount of data that China is producing is off the charts relative to the world. And that's allowing China to build competitive advantages in newer areas like artificial intelligence. So, look, China may not be following the blueprint that many of us assumed it would 10 or 15 years ago, but I don't think we can deny there's something interesting going on here. China isn't just about dirty factories and cheap labor. There are hints here of a country that actually is capable of competing with and perhaps even superseding the best of what the rest of the world has to offer. So that, I think, is the first piece of good news that's been happening under Xi. The next piece of good news, perhaps slightly more controversially, is in the environment. China's environmental problems are very, very well known. It's one of the biggest prices that China has paid for 40 years of turbocharged industrialization. What this chart here shows you is air quality in Beijing, as measured by the US EPA. And to give you an idea of what these numbers mean, anywhere above 100 is considered unhealthy, and anywhere above 300 is considered downright hazardous. Now, this isn't a new problem. Every year since at least 2013, the government has said the war on pollution is a priority, and every year they have failed to meet their targets. And things have got particularly bad over winter. You can see by the spike in winter when the temperatures change. Look at this year, that spike didn't happen. And it's not just air quality. There's a whole series of measures, carbon emissions, water consumption, energy use, and things finally seem to be heading in the right direction in China. So what's going on here is something different this time. Well, one big change is the way in which local government officials are incentivized in China. It used to be just about GDP above all else. Now they're incentivized on a much broader range of measures, and they'll be held accountable for damage after they've left office. And alongside that, Xi's put in place some of the most ambitious environmental targets of any country in the world. So EVs, electric vehicles. China expects EVs to account for half of all auto sales within the next 10 years. So it's yet another China paradox. This is the world's biggest emitter of carbon, and yet it's suddenly become a trailblazer in the fight against climate change. If you flick to the next slide, you can see that this progress that China has made on the E bit of ESG is interesting, because this is an area where China is still seen as a major laggard. When MSCI finally agreed to put A shares in the index this summer, they caveated that decision with charts like this. If you look at EM as a whole, which are the green bars, you can see that about 8% of companies in emerging markets get MSCI's worst rating on ESG. But if you look at China, that goes up to 18%. And if you look at Chinese A shares, the gray bars, that goes up to 35%. So on the assumption that China is a large and potentially growing part of our investable universe, how on earth should we think about this? How worried should we be? I think there's few mitigating factors to this ostensibly gloomy outlook. First thing to note is that these poor ratings on ESG partly reflect the composition of Chinese stock markets. So Chinese stock markets are very biased towards the industrial sector where pollution is an issue. They're also very, very biased towards the state-owned enterprise sector, or SOEs, where for sure governance is more ambiguous. However, both of these have been falling as privately owned companies in the service sector have taken over as the main driver of China's growth. And to give you an idea, 50% of Chinese companies in the stock market are state-owned enterprises. That's a big number. For EM as a whole, it's only about 25%. But a decade ago, that would have been closer to 90%. One other factor in China's low ratings is disclosure. It's not necessarily that these companies are poor in their ESG practices. It's simply that we don't have enough information to judge. And again, to give you some statistics, globally, about 25% of companies around the world now produce sustainability reports. In China, it's only about 2%. So it's a problem, for sure. But again, that isn't that unusual for markets at this early stage of development. We've seen this before, other frontier markets and emerging markets, Japanese small caps. Initially, it's a real struggle to get disclosure, but over time, in response to investor questioning and investor engagement, the situation has tended to improve. One final issue I'd like to mention that often comes up in the context of Chinese governments, and it's another acronym, VIEs, Variable Interest Entities. Now, these are legal structures that are used by some Chinese companies to get around restrictions on foreign investment in certain sectors like education and the internet. And what these structures tend to mean is the local founders, the Chinese founders, have disproportionately high voting rights relative to foreign shareholders. So again, that makes some people scary. But I think, rather than worrying too much about SOEs or VIEs or the whole, noodle bowl of scary-sounding acronyms, there is a bigger question you have to ask. And that's the question you have to ask whether companies from China or Brazil or South Korea. And it's about alignment. What's the alignment of stakeholders? What's the alignment between investors, between management teams, between the Chinese government, and between Chinese society more broadly? I think when it comes to the Communist Party, we actually have a reasonable degree of visibility into what they want. They want to stay in power. And they are acutely aware that staying in power depends on their maintaining that legitimacy. And a big part of that legitimacy, for sure, comes from having a robust economy. So I think this is where investors can start to gain a degree of comfort with alignment. Those at the center of China's economic team understand the need for a vibrant economy. They are acutely aware of the fact that the only source of employment growth over the last decade in China has been the private sector, not the state sector. And they've made huge efforts to build greater international recognition for China's capital markets, with the A shares, for example. So the idea that Beijing is hell-bent on nationalizing large chunks of the private sector or imposing haircuts on foreign investors, this to me just seems like a massive breach of what the party actually wants and what they've been working towards over the last 10 or 15 years. Now, having said that, there has been a clear shift in political priorities for the last few years. It's no longer about the quantum of GDP growth in China. It's now much more about the quality of GDP growth. And Xi made that very clear at the party congress last October when he referred to the people's need for a better life. This is a recurring theme in all of his speeches now. What does he mean by that? Well, it's usually assumed that this will mean supporting people lower down the pyramid. It will mean making sure they see less corruption in their daily lives. It will mean better access to healthcare and to education and giving them cleaner air to breathe. And of course, it will include making them proud to be citizens of a country that is resurgent on the international stage. And this shift in emphasis will have implications for Chinese companies. They'll need to show support for Xi's mission. Put it another way, labor has subsidized capital in China for the last 40 years. I think it's quite plausible that pendulum will now start to shift the other way. I think this is not necessarily a bad thing for Chinese companies or for Chinese investors or for Chinese society more broadly, but there may well be disruption as we adjust to these new priorities. So I mentioned the environmental targets, for example. Beijing's top-down targets on the environment are so aggressive that there's a real risk that companies in the old economy in particular will really struggle to comply with these targets and possibly face sanctions as a result. By contrast, my impression is that quite a lot of the newer generation of Chinese companies already have a profound sense of social mission, almost. And I mentioned Alibaba earlier. I think this is an interesting one. Just ahead of Alibaba's initial public offering in 2015, the founder, Jack Ma, made his priorities very clear. He said, first, come my customers. Second, come my employees. And third, and only third, come shareholders. Now that spooked a lot of foreign investors at the time, but the fact that Alibaba's share price has subsequently doubled hopefully indicates that all the social good that Alibaba does, the millions of jobs they create, the hundreds of thousands of SMEs that they've helped to penetrate new markets, none of that should be considered inconsistent with gains for shareholders. So I think that companies like Alibaba do give us an encouraging hint of where China's future might lie. I'm conscious of time, so I will stop talking now. But I hope the key message that I've left you with is an optimistic one rather than just a scary one. Yes, China is confusing, it's complex, there will be lots of challenges for investors over the next decade or two, but I think there will also be lots of opportunities. And I take comfort from the fact that where Western analysis of China has tended to go wrong, it's not been in the failure to spot China's problems, it's been in the failure to anticipate or appreciate China's strengths. Thank you. Very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Will. Go to some questions. Sharon?
Yeah, thanks so much. This is obviously big in the news. It's something that I really appreciate getting a deeper dive into China. And I just wondered if you could comment a little more on what you see as potential risks or opportunities with whether they're future trade wars or they're happening right now. I mean, depending on who you talk to, but the issues that are happening right now, obviously with trade with China and our current government and the implications for us as investors, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't put anything in the slide on this, but I think it is worth thinking about because it will have some implications in the short term, but I think in the longer term too, and it comes back to this geopolitical struggle almost. In the short term, trade wars, of course, matter. I think you can see the very poor performance of the Chinese stock market over the last 6 months or so. So I think the market is saying, they're almost agreeing with this view that trade wars are a zero-sum game where America is the beneficiary and everyone else is the loser. In a Chinese context, trade or exports currently account for about 15% of GDP, and exports to the US will account for about 15% of that. So it's not as big as it used to be. China's a far less export-oriented economy than it was 10 years ago, but it's still significant. On the other hand, China has a lot of tools it can use to offset a slowdown in trade. So monetary policy has been very tight in China over the last couple of years, so they could loosen policy. I don't think they want to because they're trying to deflate a big credit bubble at the moment, so they'd rather not do that, but they could. Again, there are other tools. They could devalue their currency. Again, I don't think they're going to because they've spent so much of the last 10 or 15 years trying to present the renminbi as a credible currency for foreign investors, but they could use that tool if they wanted to. So that's the impact on China. What I'm not qualified to talk about is where this goes for the rest of the world and America, but there's big questions there, right? America has $250 billion of direct investments in China. $500 billion of revenues for American companies come from China. So if we are going to see a disentangling of the Chinese and the American economies, I think that it gives us lots of bigger issues to think about, potentially for the role of the dollar in the world, for the role of China in global finance. The RMB is potentially a replacement for the dollar. There's lots of interesting places to take this, but I think a lot of these are above my station for now.
Thank you.
Anyone else yet? Lynn?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very interesting. I was wondering if there's ever been a situation, either in China or another emerging market, where you've looked at the ESG factors and just were not able to get beyond that. And if you could give us an example of what that might have been.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just to give you a bit of background to the way we run CalSTR's EM mandate, what we like to do, we're growth managers. We run a concentrated portfolio of 40 stocks. We like to find the 40 best companies with the best growth prospects in emerging markets, and then we like to hold them for a long time. So within the CalSTR's portfolio, 60% of the names we've held for more than 5 years, and about a third of the portfolio we've held for more than 10 years. So hopefully we are long term. And that means that ESG issues for us are intertwined with the investment case. They play out over the longer term. So, I want to invest in companies that are doing good things for society, because chances are these are the ones that are going to have the biggest growth opportunities. I want to invest in companies that have good relations with their employees and their suppliers and that care about their environmental impact, because I think that actually increases their competitive advantages over the long term. So this idea that you have to have a trade-off between ESG on the one hand and good investment returns on the other, that makes no sense to me. I think ESG has to be part of the investment returns. So yeah, companies with bad ESG practices probably won't even make it anywhere close to the pass when it comes to finding these 40 names that we're looking for. But in China in particular, there's a lot. I mentioned the environmental campaign. You would have thought that would be a great source of opportunities for a portfolio that thinks about ESG. But where we've struggled is actually with the business practices of a lot of these companies. So we've looked at companies in the solar supply chain, for example. They seem to tick the box when it comes to ESG, but actually when you look at the practice of these companies, a lot of their low costs are about the fact that they have quite a relaxed attitude towards exposing their employees to dangerous chemicals, for example, and that's just something we don't think is going to be sustainable over the long term. So we just don't even look at these companies in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Before I get to you, Joy, Chris was trying to get my attention. So, Chris?
Yeah, Will, that we have 21 risk factors. Many of those are designed really along Western democracy. So from a big picture standpoint, I look at your last two bullet points up there, and I'll pick on Alibaba. So we think carefully about alignment. Alibaba does a lot of nice things, but as you said in bullet number 4, it has to support Xi's vision, which is for a totalitarian government. So how do we as a California public pension plan deal with companies that might be doing good, but do we just have to hold our nose and come to grips with a government that's different than what we think are our cultural values of freedom, things like that?
Yeah, it's a great and complex.
I didn't think yes and no.
So I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of this right here. If you look at the CalSTRS, the formula, the 21 risk factors, yeah, China actually does surprisingly well on a lot of these, the transparency ones. The quality of China's statistics is a lot better than many people think. Some of the newer risk factors that have been put in, the environmental ones, again, these are all ones that China scores well on. Where they score poorly, of course, as you know, it's the authoritarian nature of politics, it's human rights, it's civil liberties, exactly. I don't know how we can adjust our thinking looking through a Western lens. China is an authoritarian country, as I said. It's become more authoritarian under Xi, and if anything, recent measures that have been in place are designed to increase the oversight that the party has over the economy. I don't think you can get away with that. So whether you want to say, I can't go there, it's just too bad, or our approach is to not to hold our noses, but to actually look for the positives in this. And in companies like Alibaba, okay, it may be nothing like democracy as we know it, but I think there is evidence here. I talked about the job creation. I talked about the hundreds of thousands of SMEs who are benefiting. There is evidence here of a system that is capable of creating wealth for the many rather than the few. So as long as we can see that potential, yeah, whether it's holding your nose or simply looking on the upside, I think it's not a hopeless case.
Joy?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I think I just want to ask a follow-up to Chris's question. So it sounds like the approach to looking at the ESG factors it's not necessarily absolute. It's not taking the list of factors and checking yes or no whether they're met, and if they don't meet all 21, then they're in or out. But it's really looking at them across the board and using some judgment based on what you know about the company, what they're doing, what you think the forward progress is, and looking at it a little bit more qualitatively?
Yeah, absolutely. So we try not to have a negative screen, almost. We will not invest in a company which has bad ESG practices and we don't see it becoming better. Because as I say, I just don't see how you will make good shareholder returns over the longer term in these sorts of companies. It might buy you an advantage in the short term, but I don't think it'll be sustainable longer term. However, that doesn't mean we only invest in perfect companies. So for example, we actually recently took a holding for the CalSTRS portfolio in, well, it's a Russian company, Norilsk Nickel, which is a big polluter. It's got an 80-year track record of very significant sulfur dioxide emissions. And up until a year or two ago, I would have considered this company uninvestable. It's just too bad from an environmental perspective. But actually, over the last couple of years, we've been following it, and something quite interesting has been happening. They've been spending about $2 billion a year in trying to improve their environmental track record. They've been making huge efforts to reconfigure their processes, and they've been working with companies in Europe and America to try to get better at sulfur dioxide capture, for example. So all of this, I think, is quite encouraging. And we actually took a holding in Norilsk Nickel, partly because it's a great play on EVs. This is the dilemma for environmentalists. If the world were to go 100% electric vehicle tomorrow, the Earth's resources of nickel would be wiped out. So there is a role here. And I think that's where our role as long-term shareholders comes in. If our presence on the shareholder register as long-term shareholders can be helpful in persuading companies like Norilsk Nickel, please keep investing in improving their environmental track record. Keep on, let's keep on seeing those emission levels come down. If our presence can be helpful in that respect and not encourage them just to go back to cutting money and going back to the bad old ways, then I think that's probably quite a good outcome.
Okay, that's helpful. That was a helpful example. May I ask one follow-up question? The slide you had up earlier that looked at progress in China, in terms of retail, on the internet, social media usage, et cetera, and you were pointing out that that had all happened under an authoritarian regime and quite quickly, was really interesting. Although I also found it really fascinating that you said the U.S. average of social media use of 1 hour a day seemed really low.
Yeah. She has kids.
Yeah, I've got kids too. But I guess when you look at the progress they've made so far, we already talked a little bit about what's in the news now with with the trade battles. But are there other scenarios, other things that might concern you in the future that could slow down the progress China has been making, looking at some of the data you put up earlier?
Yeah, I think the question that Chris raised earlier is certainly one we're keeping an eye on. That's probably the more uncomfortable one. Human rights and so forth. We're working with a lot of external agencies to ensure that our own enthusiasm for some of these Chinese tech names isn't blinding us to the realities of what's going on. I guess one of the other big concerns that people have in China is debt. Debt is 240% of GDP. That's doubled over the last 7 or 8 years. I'm not too worried about that, and I deliberately didn't put any slides in the presentation about that, because I don't really worry. The classic emerging market crisis happens not because of the amount of debt, but because that debt is owed to foreigners, and foreigners will suddenly withdraw that funding. The nice thing about Chinese debt is it's all owed to other Chinese people. So there's and it's underwritten to a certain extent by the Chinese government, given how much of it went towards funding the state-sponsored investment program. But perhaps I'm wrong about that. And perhaps, as I'm saying, the response to a slowdown in the economy that comes from trade wars, perhaps China will go back to the bad old ways of just turning on the credit taps, and each dollar of debt becomes more and more unproductive. I think that's something we're definitely going to keep an eye on. I don't think it's an existential risk for China. I think they can keep on kicking the can down the road when it comes to that debt pile for a long time. But to the extent that it might endanger the rebalancing away from investment and towards consumption that we've seen such encouraging signs of in recent years, then that's definitely something that I'm keeping an eye on.
Thank you.
Lynn, I had you back here in the queue.
Oh, no, I'm not.
Okay, thanks. I was going to jump right to Nora. Nora?
Thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful. But I want to ask you a question based on, I read your bio and some of your background. And so if you can tell me a little bit about because I struggle a lot with this around the role of investment managers in this concept of a more equitable society. I think you started talking about this a little bit. And then I know you've done some work around diversity and inclusion initiatives. So can you talk a little bit about that and share your insight with us, please?
Yeah, okay. So Yeah, I think our industry has not covered itself in glory when it comes to providing a more equitable society. Our response to that is it's some of the issues I was talking about. It's if we can do one thing for companies, it's finding great companies and saying to them, look, we don't care about your profits in the short term. If you see a great investment opportunity that's 5 or 10 years in the future, then invest in that opportunity. Don't worry about trying to smooth your profits in the short term. Don't worry about paying me a big dividend in the short term. Just invest in that longer term opportunity. Don't worry about having to cut employees or not invest in factories. I think if we can do that and be quietly supportive for our companies in the inevitable bad times that all companies go through, I think hopefully that will help to provide a more equitable society. I was depressed to read a statistic suggesting that when an interview of managers of SP 500 companies saying whether they would rather invest in value accretive projects over the long term if it meant missing their quarterly earnings in the short term, they all said, no, we don't want to miss our quarterly earnings in the short term. That to me is a tragic indictment of what's gone wrong with capitalism. So anything we can do to reposition the companies we invest in on a longer term framework, I hope will be helpful in that respect. The diversity and inclusion one, yeah, this is something we've been thinking a lot about. There's a lot of ways of thinking about diversity and inclusion, obviously. If you take gender, for example, again, we're not an industry that has covered ourselves in glory. Only about 10% of portfolio managers in the UK are female, for example. So our approach to that, we tried about 15 years ago to shift our recruitment practices. And interesting, we try to recruit people. Just to give you an idea, we've got 106 investors in Scotland. 96 of those started on our graduate recruitment program. So they spent their entire careers at Baillie Gifford. So we like to get people young, and we like to get them from a variety of disciplines. So my degree was in Russian history. We've got philosophers, we've got musicians, we've got criminologists, we've got romantic literature graduates. These are the people you will see at Baillie Gifford. And I don't know whether, because we are deliberately targeting people who might not necessarily have thought of a career in finance, I think that's been quite helpful in redressing some of the gender issues we've had in applications. So if you look at our recruitment ratios over the last 10 years, for example, they've been at 50-50 male-female for the last 10 years now. Now, we, like many other firms in our industry, have a historic legacy that goes back to the 1990s when we only recruited people that looked like me. But, I think we've got the pipeline. What matters now is ensuring that, the people in that pipeline we want to progress are getting every opportunity to progress. And there's lots of initiatives we've got underway to deal with that. But yeah, as an industry, we've got a huge way to go on this.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I was going to ask if Stephen and Neil had either a specific question or a more macro question for Will. Steve?
Thanks, Harry. Steve McCourt, Makita Investment Group. I more just wanted to add a couple of items to Will's presentation, which I think rightly started with sort of an open question: is China more of an emerging market or developed market? The other big risk factor in China, which increasingly makes it look more like a developed market, is demographics. And there's lots of macro challenges that China face that look a whole lot more like our macro challenges than those of most other emerging market countries. I also wanted to tie it into the conversation before this on benchmarks, the importance of benchmarks. MSCI, as Will mentioned, is starting to include onshore A-shares in their emerging market benchmarks. As time moves on, the likelihood is they will continue to increase the weight of those shares in their benchmark. But different investors will take a very different view of how much China exposure they want in their portfolios. As a consequence, all the benchmark creators will create several different types and styles of benchmarks. There'll be benchmarks that exclude China. There'll be benchmarks that cap the weight of China. And so benchmark selection becomes a really, really critical decision and very influential decision for the board and and portfolios. I wanted to make one other comment on Sharon's question on trade wars. I would encourage people to think about trade wars and tariffs not as an isolated event, but really just a small part of a much larger and longer term geopolitical game that's played between major countries, and this game's been played for centuries. My personal belief is if the U.S. were entering tariffs as a way to engage more with other Asian economies, China would be scared to death. Given that the U.S. has entered tariffs with China as a way to pull back from the global economy, China's likely next reaction is to pick up the phone and call every other Asian country and say, your U.S. friend, post-World War II, is no longer your U.S. friend. We're your friend going forward. And that's a challenging thing because China has a major trust issue with lots of different countries, but that's their long game. And so that's a 30 or 40 year process, but I would encourage you to think of it in those terms.
So before we let you go, Will, thanks for your presentation. I'm sure it wasn't tough duty to get out of Scotland to come to California.
It rains 300 days a year.
Yeah, I know.
It's never a chore.
Sun's shining here.
Yeah.
So far away.
You've survived yourself. The EM, not China specific, but EMs in particular, in general terms, we know the last decade what the U.S. markets have done, right? And we look at over a 20-year period, and we know where price-to-earnings ratios are, and we know the impact that monetary policy has had on returns over the last decade in particular. And if you put a chart next to that to EM, and you looked at the performance in EM, and you looked at price-to-earning ratios of EM markets today, and you looked at the demographics, and you looked at the hundreds of millions of people moving into the middle class and consumption, right? From a policy perspective, how should we be thinking about that? In a portfolio that half the portfolio is dedicated to the public markets.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. People invest in emerging markets because they believe in this growth story, that in the income catch-up story, and unfortunately the reality is quite different. It's very hard to emerge. I think only 5 countries have done it in the last 250 years. So yeah, it is tough, and I think markets get overexcited at certain points, as they clearly did towards the 2010, 11, 12. It's tough to emerge. And yeah, as you say, that's been reflected. The very disappointing macro story we've seen really since 2012 from emerging markets has been reflected in lousy equity performance. Over the last 10 years, EM has gone nowhere in dollar terms. It's still below the 2007 peak. Over the last 5 years, we've seen EM go nowhere again, and the S&P is up, 70%. As June and Candice and the rest of the guys we speak to know, we've actually become a lot more positive about emerging markets recently. And, we've been doing this since 1994. There have been periods of time when we've been pretty cautious on the outlook for returns in emerging markets. So the late 90s was such a period when we had most of our portfolios in exporters that benefited from currency weakness. Again, we've been pretty cautious again, really from 2012 to 2015. But we're getting a bit more enthusiastic now about the outlook for returns. And this is simply a function of almost mean reversion. A lot of the economies that we look at have been through a horrible period of time over the last 5 years. They've had very severe domestic contractions. Currencies have been very, very weak. Banking cycles have completely ground to a halt. The thing that encourages us now, I guess, is the desynchronized nature of the global recovery. US has been expanding. It's in the 9th year of expansion now. It was the first country to embrace full-blown QE. But other countries have been much slower. So obviously, Japan, it wasn't until 2013, Europe till 2015. And again, the bit of the world that I look at, emerging markets, interest rates have only really started to be cut in the last 2 years or so. So Brazil, Russia, countries like that, interest rates have gone from the mid-teens to single digits over the last 2 years. Now, is it possible, therefore, that we are at a stage in the cycle that the US has been in for much of the last 10 years, where monetary policy remains very, very accommodative in emerging markets, and yet profits are slowly recovering. And as you point out, we're coming at this from point of quite a lot of depression that's factored into valuations. The EM index is trading on 12 times this year's earnings compared to much, much higher multiples elsewhere in the world. So, I'm not very good. I make no claim to be an expert at predicting where markets will go over the next 12 months or so. And if we see a continuation of the strong dollar environment that you've had so far this year, there is a Pavlovian mechanism in investors' minds that will say, look, this is bad for EM. I don't think that's fair. I think EM's in a much better position than it was even 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago when it comes to external debt and so forth. But on a 5-year view, yeah, I think I definitely suggest we're a lot more excited about the outlook for returns from the MSCI Emerging Markets Index than we have been for most points within the last decade.
Thanks. I don't see anyone else in the queue. Thank you for your presentation, your larger, 40,000-foot level view, and also insights into how Baillie Gifford manages our mandate and how you're doing that and how you look at that opportunity. So thank you very much. Thanks, June, for getting Will to be with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks.